Hello, and thank you for joining us for yet another episode of our Achieving Alpha podcast, a series on accelerating returns for private equity funds. Today is the part two of our discussion in the consumer space and discussing lean FMCG, where we will be specifically deep diving into enablers and organizations that can support the lean FMCG model. Joining us yet again is Umesh Shah. Just a little bit of a recap. Umesh has spent the last 30 years in FMCG and most of this time with Unilever, where he has served as the CEO of Unilever International, a global business unit that he himself conceptualized to play in white spaces in brands, channels, geographies, and consumers that Unilever operating companies do not cover. So thank you, Umesh, for joining us. You have a lengthy experience designing and scaling up a lean FMCG model, which is Unilever International. So based on your experience, we really want to understand what are the key enablers of lean FMCG organizations and what organizational and cultural changes are necessary to implement this model successfully.
Thanks for invite and my pleasure to be on this podcast. Yes, in the last podcast, we spoke about lean FMCG model. We also said it's highly agile, less risky, low cost. Yeah. So, obviously the question is, what are the key enablers to implement this lean FMCG model? And I had a privilege of implementing that for almost 10 years. And I can tell you that while it looks good on paper, it's not that simple. The key enablers in building and scaling up lean FMCG models are three parts. One is leadership, second is culture, and third is talent of your own company. So let's start with the leader himself. First of all, leader and the sponsors of that leader. Okay, sponsors means the leader bosses in the organization. So they should be really sponsoring this model, because there are a lot of always questions. For example, when you move out from in-house to external players, the question of product quality, question of compliance, question of regulatory, question of privacy, they all crops up. And it's important that the leadership really need to understand that, look, all these questions can be answered. And there are players who are doing it so effectively. So it's very important that leadership really buys and supports this model. Otherwise, it cannot be done. That's the first thing. Second thing is the leaders themselves really need to kind of dirty their hands or get into the mud to ensure that they themselves understand. They can't be a typical leader which kind of remains at a 50,000 feet and really starts operating, because this is a model where a leader needs to really experience himself. For example, he needs to visit the third party players. He must talk to the ecosystem players, whether it's a logistics service provider or whether it is distributors in a particular country. So that's a leadership setup. And secondly is a kind of a talent requirement is very different here. My experience is that when I started recruiting talent for Unilever International, when I started getting into that and people came in 30% of the time, people realize what's happening here. What are we trying to do here? There is no structure here. It is a kind of the person who comes in needs to be comfortable with unstructured way of working. Yeah. And in my case, 30% of the people say, oh my God, what's happening? But 70% of young people say, my God, this is what I like it. I have a full freedom. I can go and really travel and choose my manufacturer. I can choose my distributor. I want to move fast. And typical own organization doesn't move fast. So it's a talent which really is important. The talent needs to be having a founder's mentality, because here everybody is a general manager. Because if a marketing manager comes, he or she will not have any own resources supporting them. So basically the person has to go out, evaluate so many players and say, hey, how can I really work with them. So that mindset of going out and finding out the right players who can support, it's very important. So that's a talent part. And then the culture is again is very different. Culture of agility, culture of risk taking, culture of believing that others also can do better than us, and more importantly is that the culture of don't leave anything on the table, okay, just because you don't have resources. Find out the resources. And in the new AI enabled world, it's even better. So there are clearly key enablers in terms of leadership, talent, and culture.
So thanks, Umesh. So it seems like that's a pretty significant shift, right? We're talking about having very hands-on leaders, we're talking about having very entrepreneurial talent, and we're talking about almost like a very hungry culture, right? So for organizations who have for years operated under the traditional FMCG model, can they adapt to the lean model? How difficult would it be to make that change and make that shift? And can you give us some examples?
So definitely there are many examples where companies have moved from a traditional FMCG to a lean FMCG model. I think a key question, as I said, is a leadership. And once leaders are really convinced of that, you need to feel comfortable in operating without any of the own resources. It's very difficult sometimes to kind of work and build a company with a very small number of own resources. People are comfortable in having all the resources in the company next to each other, and that belief or that culture needs to be managed. Yeah, so that's the first thing. Second thing is yes, it's all about the selection of ecosystem players. The transitioning is not easy, and the transition needs to be carefully planned and ensure that you first really do a lot of homework. You need to really divide the entire task into various functions. So first thing is, who is going to do your product development? Who will be your partner for consumer insight? Who will be your partner for regulatory compliance? Who will be your partner in manufacturing? And who will be your partner in distribution and marketing? So it's all about good selection of all the ecosystem players. And once you have that, you realize that you have the solutions available for very agile operations. In one of the cases where we are working today is that MNC company operating in a country has been able to deploy only 30% of the portfolio. When we proposed them to move to a lean FMCG model and explain them the advantages, the biggest advantage came from the ability to deploy most of the relevant portfolio into that country. Currently, when you ask them why are you not deploying entire portfolio in a country, the response was that, oh, we don't have bandwidth, we don't have resources. Here, now we are proposing them that you operate with 3 or 4 distributors with specialized capabilities, and you can bring in the portfolio, the base of the portfolio relevant for that country, and implement that. So that's how the value creation happens.
Thank you. So when we think about building a lean FMCG model or a lean FMCG organization, it seems like we have to think beyond, internal resources. When you think about who we're partnering with, what kind of not just what kind of qualifications they have, but also what kind of abilities they have, right? So how can PE firms assist in building the necessary capabilities within their portfolio companies?
There are many experts available outside who have operated this model for a number of years and for a number of companies. I think it's important to really get the subject matter expertise recruited there. So for example, what you need for a lean FMCG model is that the subject matter experts who have operated with ecosystem players. And first of all, it's not something new or something the rocket science. Look at people like Apple. Apple doesn't have any of its own manufacturing. Everything they manufacture is all by the third-party players. There's no reason, if Apple and many others can do it, there's no reason why a simple consumer products cannot be produced. So that belief is a must. And then you need to look for the resources who can really come in and build capabilities.
And I think our final question here, right, as we think about transitioning to a lean FMCG model, whether that's a PE portfolio company or a traditional FMCG company, what role does leadership play in driving this transition?
It's very important. Leadership plays a very big role. As I mentioned in the earlier podcast, that it's first is leadership needs to be convinced about the model. Second is the talent, talent recruitment. One needs to really ensure that the right talent really comes in. And the third is rewarding the talent and rewarding ecosystem players. You cannot really run a lean FMCG model with a suboptimal quality FMCG ecosystem players. You need to ensure that all your risk are covered well. So chasing cost sometimes is not the answer. You need to be really ensuring, because if something goes wrong, you are not pardoned. If some product quality goes off, then we have a problem.
Thank you so much, Umesh, for joining us today to talk
Thank
more
you. My
about Lean
pleasure.
FMCG. And please tune in for our next episode.